So hello everyone, I am Ren and I have decided to create a little video to try to explain my philosophical approach, thinking that maybe some people will find it interesting, useful, a bit clearer as well, since I know that sometimes my writing can sound a little abstruse, a little complex, a little charlatanesque maybe. I hope not, but in any case, I have had several people over time ask me if I could sort of explain to them, like verbally, maybe in like more straightforward terms or something, what it is that I'm interested in philosophically, what it is that those notes I'm currently sharing on the forum are about. So as it turns out, it's always easier for me to sort of explain things in writing. I'm probably not the only one to experience that, and it's probably harder than anything else to explain myself in like direct communication on Skype, for example. I know that I have friends who might recognize themselves who've asked me before to explain stuff, and I'd almost like sort of delay things. I'd be like, yeah, maybe next week, and then eventually never do it because it's actually really, really hard. But I've been thinking about the matter in my head, and recently I explained my system. I know it sounds very pretentious, sorry about that, but to my brother, open monism. And I did it in a series of like voice recordings and found that it worked quite well. I was maybe inspired that day, maybe I'd slept well. As things stand, he thought it was useful and he basically told me, yes, it's clear to me. So this is the context. I'm trying to do the same thing that I did with my brother, but in a video. So how do I explain where I'm coming from? So basically, I think a good start to, start with is to really begin with the interrogations of Nietzsche. I think that if I really have to locate the beginning of my, of my investigations and maybe the original approach that I'm trying to promote, it begins with an engagement with the philosophy of Nietzsche. I think that Nietzsche is really one of the greatest philosophers of all time, even though on many levels I find his ethical views repellent or maybe like diametrically opposed to mine. Still, as a philosopher, as a shaker of ideas, as a challenger to the status quo at the time, philosophically speaking, the more I engage with his thoughts, even the more I just progress as a philosopher, let's say, I realize just how much of an earthquake his philosophy was. And basically what I like about Nietzsche and what inspires me about him, what has inspired me to bring a new perspective maybe on sort of a movement that he started with Schopenhauer, but Nietzsche was more instrumental, I think, in sort of creating a movement. It's a kind of rebellion, you can call it that. It's a kind of rebellion against the concept of essence. It's really like if there is a start to open monism, is to say openness is in opposition to essence. So what do I mean by this? Because maybe like for a newcomer they might say, well, okay, well, what the fuck is essence? And so I think that's here the best way to describe what I mean is to return to the ancient times and like really just travel all the way back to Plato. So Plato is the most famous philosopher of all time, perhaps together with Aristotle. who is in many respects a disciple of Plato. He was Plato's student, even though he created his own movement. And Aristotelianism is very different from Platonism. I mean, they do share that basic a priori conviction that the most basic nature of things is to be understood in terms of essence. So you take anything in the world, you take the reality around you, you take your conception of yourself, the way that people understand these things, the way they try to get at the bottom of these things, the way that anybody in your environment will say, well, okay, now I've understood what you mean, is by saying, I got the gist of it, I got the essence of, okay, what do you mean formally speaking? You know, thinking in terms of forms, in terms of a particular perimeter to something, that once you have identified its outline, you've understood the thing. And if you've understood the thing, you sort of have a sense of, you've grasped the being of that thing, you've grasped what that thing is, right? And the way that we, in everyday language, which really shows that Plato has won against other philosophers who were prior to him at the time, like Heraclitus. Some of you know that I'm a big fan of Heraclitus. Plato just said, you can fix everything as an essence that exists somewhere. So you have a book, you know, for example, I've got this book here. Somewhere in some dimension or wherever it is, metaphysically speaking, there is the essence of what this is. You cannot really just sum it up and say, this is what it is. And it has its own individuality as it is here. What Plato says is really that for us to even make sense of this as an individual book, it means that somewhere in the universe, somewhere in reality, exists the pure form of this. And every time that we understand what the book is, or what a lamp is, what a human being is, what an animal of any sort is, or what a swimming pool is, and thinking about swimming pools because it's one just out there, not boasting, but it's true. We always think in terms of a particular circle, if you like, you know, and you say, once you've identified the sort of diameter and the circumference, the totality of the sort of variables that constitute that object, you've understood it and you sort of know what the object is about. And this, you can also call it a commitment to the unity of things, you know, so you have a unified thing, and in order to approach it, you sort of need to think in terms of how to get to the core of it, what are the essential properties of it. Once you have them in mind, you know what this is. And applying that to the whole nature of reality is what Platonism does. And Aristotle, you know, continues down that line with his concept of substance, which eventually led to the whole, you know, debate between dualism and monism, or pluralism, thinking about the universe in terms of different substances, okay? But really, to come back to Nietzsche, what Nietzsche said was, why is that? Why do we think that way? Is it the only way that we can conceive of things, the world, of being? Maybe that's not the way that beings should be conceived, as something that, in a sense, limits them. You know, you say, this is what it is. Ren is who he is, anybody else. I've understood that person, and that person has a consciousness that contains thoughts or whatever. That person has a self. Oh yeah, okay, so I can tell what it is now. And in a way, this is kind of like the end of that person. Not the end of the person as in the death, but just that is what the person is summarized as, I mean, conceptually. And what Nietzsche was trying to say was, this is actually only a point of view among many other points of views that were being kind of described at the time, developed at the time. It just so happens that the Platonic point of view won what he calls the transcendental point of view. The idea that, like, you have an object in real life, you encounter it. Well, transcendentally speaking, in some other worlds, you can access it transcendentally, is the essence of it that exists in its pure form. You know, like the pure thing. You don't have access to it, it's transcendental, but if you're religious, you might think that God helps you access it. You know, it's the same kind of logic, the transcendental logic. And what Nietzsche said was everything is immanent. immanent, not imminent, but immanent. So everything that is just is there and tends to expand. So the nature of things, according to Nietzsche, is not that of an essence that has to be sort of limited to what it is as an object, let's say, to which a subject, myself, relates. And by the way, subject is also an essence. So maybe I can sort of find, or someone who's committed to the Platonic point of view, which was reinforced later by Thomas Aquinas, Descartes, very much a Platonic essentialist from that respect, with his concept of consciousness, the subject, etc., but also Kant and his transcendental subject. All these people say we can provide limits to what things are, but also limits to what ethics are, for example. So this is a set of maxims that you must follow, and this is what it is, and this is your duty. Do not do this, do that, avoid this, love your neighbor, don't kill, etc. Nietzsche was saying, the question is not whether there should be duties or not. That's only one way to look at morals. And if we rethink the nature of a being, far from the concept of essence, if we try to break that essence, but rather think about it in terms of maybe a force, not something that is like a circle and that has limits, but something that constantly is expanding, absorbing new things. What he calls will to power is that. Like in the will to power, really what power means is this expansion. Power is in a sense the sort of, not opposite, but the adversary, the alternative interpretation of what being is compared to essence. The essence is like you restrict something and you say this is what it is. Whether it's me, whether it's a book, whether it's whatever. The world. The will to power is like it's a ball of force. A little bit like, in Dragon Ball Z when they have Kamehamehas. It's very much the same idea. Like there's a ball of fire that can expand. And it's impossible to say exactly where it will go or how far it will expand. It will have like families of traits with other beings, but it's more to be thought of in terms of traits rather than in terms of essential features. And there's only those features and nothing else to be talked about. And this idea might seem very attractive, but also very hard to put in practice, because if you deny that essence has the last word on what things are, but you're reasoning more in terms of, for example, forces or wills to power, what becomes of concepts? What becomes of systems? Because you could say, well, concepts also are essences. They try to limit the meaning of something. You could also argue that systems are fundamentally about limiting things, saying this is what it's about. So concepts are, in a certain sense, attempts at essentializing reality or a part of reality. And, that was, in a sense, the limit, no pun intended, of Nietzsche's philosophy. The fact that he wrote what comes across as not a systematic piece of work, which is actually hyper-consistent with his worldview. He rejects essence. He thinks that there's no transcendence. Everything is here. Everything is immanent. We should celebrate life, Nietzsche says. We should celebrate what is here because that's all it is. It does not mean that what is here is not complex. There's infinite layers, complexity to reality, but it is all here, immanent. There's no world beyond. When we're thinking about a world beyond, we're unconsciously trying to say, okay, things are so complex here that we're going to imagine in our wishful thinking that there's a simple version out there. But that's what Nietzsche says. We have to face the world in all of its beauty, its ugliness, and conquer it. This is very much a metaphysical commitment that also becomes a commitment that is ethical with the overman, and also probably translates into some of his more fanciful ideas about being a conqueror, adoring the warlike life, etc. I think that you could sort of see as not as an anecdote, because it's a big part of Nietzsche's character, and he was a bit of a, he was a man full of neuroses, so that has to be acknowledged. But fundamentally, a lot of his convictions that might seem very forceful and abhorrent to some, they have a very solid metaphysical grounding, which is a commitment to non-transcendence. Everything is here, and it's a field of forces that expands, blend into each other, which is much more aligned with what Plato's predecessor Heraclitus was saying with his doctrine of the flux. When Heraclitus says, as I have shared, I think, at least once or twice on the forum, when he says, no man ever steps into the same river twice because it's not the same river and it's not the same man. I mean, it's like an incredibly profound aphorism, perhaps one of the most influential in my thinking, because it says everything about what Nietzsche was later to develop. This idea that there's no essence of the river and there's no essence of the man, because they are different by the time that the man's, like the same man, who's actually not the same man, steps into the same river, who's flowed since then. Not quite the same river. So that's the viewpoint that Nietzsche was trying to bring back into the picture. He was not just trying to develop a worldview. He was trying to say, let's keep in mind that what we have integrated to be standard metaphysics, standard epistemology, nature of knowledge, all these Cartesian mannerisms that we still have in our language when we speak about consciousness, when we speak about a subject, when we speak about objects, when we speak about thoughts. What Nietzsche said was, these are just inherited traits. We were not bound to think in these terms. And that, I think that's why Nietzsche was a great genius. I think he was a great genius because he was able to see an alternative. It's not about what his IQ was like. It's about being able to sort of zero in on an alternative, on an alternative way of thinking, which has a lot of family traits with the works of Heraclitus. I'm not going to go into detail, but there are also differences. And now that I've said this, where does open monism stand? So open monism is what I'm trying to develop. I think that before I enter into an explanation regarding open monism, I should try to maybe talk a little bit more about another thinker that is a big influence on my writing. And you're probably expecting me to say Wittgenstein. Actually, he is a huge influence. But I mean, in this case, Heidegger. Why is Heidegger important? I think because he was the first philosopher to realize that maybe there was a way to take Nietzsche's body of work and his insights about, the non-essential aspect of things, the nature of reality as non-essential, but as a force, as a will to power, and to say, this does not mean that, formally speaking, it is impossible to systemize these insights. And this is why he creates the concept of Dasein instead of the subject. Dasein means to being here, is really a way to say being here is a much more sort of non-essential way of describing a subject. Instead of saying the subject is this kind of essence who's there and who has this and that trait, and then incarnated into a self that also has this and that trait, blue eyes, French, annoying, whatever. No, he says being here. So Dasein is just you're grounded into something, and you have a perspective that is part of your culture, but you have also a certain sense of freedom to do things in the world. But you're not predefined by your condition as that of a subject. You're an open thing. At the same time, Heidegger really quickly fell into essential thinking. I think, unfortunately, this has been said by some people, not many, but it's something that very much strikes me in his writing, is that very quickly he starts talking about essence. So I think that he eventually commits the mistakes and passe Heidegger. I mean, I don't want to disrespect the man. I think he's an amazing philosopher, mind-blowing philosopher that everybody should try to read. But he does, I think, in his attempt to systemize Nietzsche, I think he falls back into some of the traps of essential thinking, Platonic thinking. Plus, whenever he tries to really sort of extricate himself from that thinking, he often sounds borderline unintelligible. And it's partly because he's trying to create new words that correspond to the concepts that Nietzsche was kind of announcing in his writings. Because if you have genuinely new ideas that are alternatives to the Platonic thinking, that has become so pervasive in the way we think that we confuse it with the nature of how we think, of course, a genuinely courageous philosopher has to create new concepts escape from the tyranny of the terminology that we're so familiar with that we just fall into the same patterns of thinking because we use the same words. So he said we can't use essence, we have to create new words. So he uses Dasein, Geworfenheit for a disposedness to something, being in a certain modes. He creates concepts like Eragnus for the events, so like reality as a disclosing rather than a state of affairs. So I'm not going to go into detail, but he creates these concepts. I think it makes sense for him to create these concepts, and he has Being and Time is a fascinating book, but there is no real system. First of all, he never finished it, and at the end of the day, I think what transpires in Heidegger are just developments of insights from Nietzsche's work, with a sort of transition from the idea of like force, expansive force, to openness, right? Dasein, being here. Not being predefined at birth by a certain genetic code and variables of what you could, over which you had no influence. And Sartre would actually develop that until the very sort of push that to logic to its limit with this idea of radical freedom. But I'm not going to go into Sartre's work. I mean, I do talk about him in my writings, most often to discredit him or to really counter him. I think that Sartre, in a way, is a slightly more watered down, naive version of Heidegger. Particularly, he makes the mistake, I think, of considering that a human being does not have to be grounded at all. So instead of being a non-essential being that still comes from a certain ground and embraces what's around him potentially, Sartre says we are not even grounded. We can be anything we want. Of course, that is very potent politically, and that can feel very liberating to some people, but I do not think that's true. I think that we have to acknowledge the fact that we are not just anything we want. There are variables that influence what we do, but they color what we do. They do not determine entirely what we do. And that's the difference, and that's also what Heidegger was trying to get at, but in a sense he was, I think, too obscure in a sense, and also maybe a little bit muddled at points. But it's very hard to talk about Heidegger, and I would like to keep this video under half an hour. Maybe, if you guys decide to watch it and you like it, you think it's a fun video, I could definitely have more videos where I talk about any philosopher that you like or detail my own philosophy, because I'm pretty familiar with those concepts, so I could definitely do that. But just wait a second, it's getting a bit dark in here. Oh. Okay. So it's I habitually just keep the blinds a little bit down because I'm not a massive fan of the bright sun, which is kind of contradictory given where I'm from. But anyway, I'm not supposed to be talking about myself here. So in all this, what is open monism? Well, open monism is really saying, well, I want to do what Heidegger did, but I want to be successful. So it's very ambitious, but I think if I didn't have that kind of ambition in life, I really just don't know what I would be doing. I think I would be very depressed all the time, and I would just have no meaning. So this is how I create my own meaning, which actually is compatible with the open monistic view. So that's it's reassuring. So basically, the insight I had was, okay, I think Nietzsche was right. I don't think that the essence is the basic unit of what is. But at the same time, I do think also that we need a system of reference that allows us to develop other branches to our philosophy from a practical point of view. Because if you look at Heidegger, like, he develops his system, but there's no ethics of Heidegger, there's no aesthetics of Heidegger. I mean, a little bit, but not much, because it's so convoluted and complex. It essentially says life is like a mystery that just passes by. But to me, that's a bit frustrating. Like, I want there to be a concrete impact possible to what I'm developing. And I think for this, unfortunately, if you need a system of reference, if you need people to be able to identify something, as what it is. Because if you say, well, the essence of what, you think that this thing or this being or this object in your world has an essence, it doesn't. It's like constantly escaping from what you think it is. Well, then how do you relate to the world? And how do you do things in the world? How do you build things? We do build things, science is a thing. It works, like there are scientific discoveries. So maybe it's not so much about rejecting completely the idea of essence by saying we're pure openness or we're pure expansion of limits or as a ball of fire or as a will to power, a will to expand. I do think that those concepts have value, but I just don't think that they are enough. So what I was trying to do is to find a compromise to a sort of, you always hear INFJs enjoy reconciling opposites or paradoxes. So I guess at the time I was not aware of my type. If by now you're still convinced I'm not, because it's the first time you see me talk, so we'll see. But yeah, I had this insight. It was kind of blurry and I didn't really know what to do with it at the time, but I had this insight that it was possible to reconcile essence and openness, broadly speaking. So to create a concept of what I initially called in my notes, the open essence. So something that does have a heart and that can be identified as such, but is defined by its nature as being open. And I very quickly intuited that this would be the basic unit of the universe in my worldview. And if that is the basic unit, an open essence, now it's changed names, as I will tell you in a second. If that is what it is, well, then the world is not really pluralist. Actually, I sort of reject the very idea of dualism or pluralism, because it thinks in terms of substances or properties, which I kind of reject. I use these terms sometimes with a very delimited, very specific meaning. But most of the time I actually refer to what I call grounds, and more specifically open grounds. So the idea that, okay, like in Nietzsche you have a will to power, so something that expands. And in Heidegger, you have the idea of a grounded being here, so something that always comes from somewhere. Well, to me, and then in Descartes, you have the essential sort of concept of consciousness, the form of a human being that does exist. And I think that what I arrived at, I was trying to think metaphorically in my head, how can I reconcile those different ideas? Something that is grounded, comes from somewhere, but also open, expands, has the ability to expand, and has a kind of form. And to me, the concept of, initially I thought in terms of wells, like a well, because it's a hole in the ground, it has water in it, so there's the idea of change, but at the same time it's very much in a place. And, systematizing that a bit more, making it more abstract, I came up with the concept of what I call open grounds, because a hole in the ground, an open ground, is a ground. It has geographical coordinates, but it's also kind of, in a sense, if you think in terms of metaphors, open to the air, open air. It's open, there's an opening there, it's open to sort of interacting with the outside world and maybe changing, maybe having things grow, having water come up and down if there's water. It's really the idea that if something is open, it's not just an abstract idea of opening. It always has a body that is sort of, that is, how do you say this? Has a body that is constituted in such a way that it is open. So openness has flesh. It's not abstract. Okay, and I think that in the real world we can really say that. When we think about something that's open and an opening, it's always from a ground, from a point of view. And if you sort of abstract that and sort of essentialize it to a term, open grounds, and I created different sets of symbols because I have a different hierarchy of categories of how open beings are, with a particular place for human being being different than other beings. Open ground, so you see the symbol of it kind of looks like a moon with a little bit of a dark part. That's the symbol for the open ground. That is the basic nature of reality in my system. So it means that At the smallest level, at the most basic metaphysical level, reality is an open ground, and we are all fragments of reality as an open ground. There's nothing more basic than that. And every time that I refer to a human being being this or that, and it's not as an open ground, I'm only saying this is only like one way, from my point of view, of talking about an open ground. So everything is in open monism an open ground, which is why it's called open monism. Monism because there's only one thing, and open because, well, what links everything, what everything has in common, not just what they have in common, what they are in common, is openings, open grounds. It doesn't mean that all open grounds are the same. Maybe a ground can be open only to sort of itself and what, imagine people walking on the ground, only open to that, or maybe open to more things. Maybe you can view things from its ground, and have more an expansive view. So this is like the metaphor that sets apart what in my system is being of a non-human nature and being of a human nature, and with the particular place that human being plays in open monism. I mean, I have to say, it is kind of a unique place, because what I try to argue is that the open grounds of human being is of a higher order compared to the open ground of other beings. So instead of being open to the combination of the variables that have been dictating the constitution of the ground at birth, like human animals, or vegetables or minerals, anything as a being. Maybe in some later videos I'll go into the different categories of being that I've identified. But unlike everything else, human being has the ability to be open not just to the variables of its grounds, but to the world itself, and to things that happen in the world outside of its limits, and make them its own. So this kind of is my own interpretation of what most of the time we talk about, we call freedom, and having that possibility of being open to something outside oneself makes you a candidate for being looked at, ethically speaking, for your maybe not necessarily actions, because maybe ethics do not necessarily target actions, but your own being can be seen ethically if you are open to more than just the variables of your ground. I'll stop here. I have not looked into Wittgenstein. I've not mentioned him in this video. I just want to say, because he's such a massive influence on my work, that I have to mention him. Wittgenstein is the man who made me realize that the source of a lot of what I talk about and a lot of what I seem to intuit in life can be seen by paying close attention at how we use language in everyday language, and at the nature of the logic, at the architecture of logic with which we function, and that allows us to use language and to make sense to each other. So formally speaking, I espouse a lot of Wittgenstein's methods. I think in terms of topic, in terms of what I talk about, the interest is predominantly Nietzschean and Heideggerian. In terms of how I approach it, decide to look at it, in terms of the aphoristic or paragraph style of my writing, the insights and how I go about them, and the focus on language and logic is my master is Wittgenstein. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and let me know if this has been boring or entertaining. And I will try to stop it at 33:33, the age of Jesus. Goodbye.